The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the dusty trail, sending Elizabeth Whitmore's carefully pinned hat askew. She clutched her worn leather valise tighter, feeling the precious bundle of letters inside shift against her ribs. Through the dust-caked window, she caught her first glimpse of Dry Creek, Wyoming territory, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the harsh landscape like cattle seeking shelter from a storm. The year was 1874, and the West was still wild enough to swallow dreams whole. Elizabeth pressed a gloved hand to her stomach, trying to quiet the butterflies that had taken residence there since leaving Boston 3 weeks prior. She was 23, considered nearly a spinster by her family's standards, with honey-colored hair that refused to stay properly pinned and gray eyes that her mother claimed were far too direct for a lady. But none of that mattered now. She was starting fresh, leaving behind the suffocating drawing rooms and whispered disappointments of her past. She pulled out one of the letters, its edges soft from constant handling. The handwriting was elegant, almost feminine in its careful loops and flourishes. "My dearest Elizabeth, how the prairie winds whisper your name though we have never met. I dream of the day when I shall read Byron to you beneath the vast western sky, where stars shine like diamonds scattered by God's own hand." The words had captivated her from the first letter. Thomas McAllister, even his name sounded poetic. A rancher who quoted Keats, who wrote of sunsets that painted the mountains purple and gold, who promised her a life of both adventure and refinement in the untamed West. After years of being overlooked by Boston society for being too outspoken, too fond of books, too everything that proper ladies weren't supposed to be, his letters had been like water to her parched soul. The stagecoach shuddered to a halt, and the driver's gruff voice cut through her reverie. "Dry Creek, end of the line!" Elizabeth's heart hammered against her corset stays as she gathered her courage. This was it. No turning back now. She had sold everything, severed ties with her disapproving family, all for this chance at happiness. The driver helped her down, and immediately the Wyoming heat slammed into her like a physical force. Her traveling dress, appropriate for Boston's mild summer, felt like a wool blanket in the merciless sun. Dust swirled around her boots, and she could taste alkali on her tongue. A small crowd had gathered, apparently. The arrival of a mail-order bride was still enough of a spectacle to draw attention in Dry Creek. Weathered faces peered at her with curiosity and something else she couldn't quite identify. Amusement? Pity? "That's her," she heard someone mutter. "The Eastern lady come for Tom McAllister. Fool girl," an older woman whispered, shaking her head. "Expecting poetry in a place that beats the pretty words right out of a man." Elizabeth lifted her chin, refusing to let their words penetrate her armor of hope. She scanned the crowd for a genteel figure, someone who might match the refined prose of those letters. Perhaps he would be wearing a proper suit, or at least a clean shirt. Perhaps he would have gentle eyes and ink-stained fingers. Then the crowd parted, and her breath caught in her throat. The man who stepped forward was nothing, absolutely nothing, like what she had imagined. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained against a dust-covered work shirt. His face was all harsh angles, weathered by sun and wind until it resembled the leather of her valise. Dark hair curled from beneath a battered hat, and his jaw was shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. His hands, she noticed with a sinking heart, were not the soft hands of a poet, but the scarred, calloused hands of a man who wrestled with barbed wire and branded cattle. He stopped 3 feet from her, and she caught the scent of horse, leather, and honest sweat. When he removed his hat, his hair was plastered to his head with perspiration. His eyes were the color of bitter coffee, hard and unreadable. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and even his voice was wrong, rough as sandpaper, with none of the cultured tones she had imagined. "I'm Tom McAllister." The butterflies in her stomach turned to lead. Behind her, she heard someone snicker. "Poet!" A man in the crowd laughed outright. "That cowboy barely knows how to write his name, let alone all them fancy words about stars and such." The truth hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. The letters, the beautiful, eloquent letters that had drawn her across half a continent. They weren't his. They couldn't be his. This man before her, with his sun-damaged skin and work-broken hands, could no more have written those lyrical passages than she could have roped a steer. She swayed on her feet, and his hand shot out to steady her elbow. Even through her gloves and sleeve, she could feel the strength in that grip, the roughness. This was not the gentle touch of a man who penned sonnets by candlelight. "You—" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "You wrote those letters?" Something flickered in his dark eyes. Shame, defiance. He released her elbow and stepped back, his jaw tightening. "We should get your things. Preacher's waiting at the church." The crowd was dispersing now, their entertainment apparently concluded. Elizabeth heard their whispers trailing behind them like dust devils. "Poor thing, dressed like she's going to a Boston tea party. She won't last a month out at the McAllister place. Tom must have paid someone good money to write those letters. Desperate times when a man's got to trick a woman into coming west." Elizabeth stood frozen in the middle of the street, her dreams crumbling around her like the false-fronted buildings that lined Dry Creek's main thoroughfare. She had traveled 3,000 miles for a lie. She had given up everything for pretty words written by a stranger's hand. Tom McAllister stood before her, solid and immovable as the mountains that rose in the distance, waiting. He didn't offer explanations or apologies. He didn't try to charm her with borrowed words. He simply waited, patient as the land itself, for her to make her choice. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Elizabeth felt her carefully constructed vision of her future dissolve like morning mist. In its place stood only the harsh reality of the West, a place that apparently had no room for poetry, only survival. "The church," she finally managed, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "Yes, we should go to the church." Because what else could she do? She had no money for return passage, no family who would welcome her back. She had gambled everything on a dream, and lost. Now all that remained was to see what kind of life could be built on the ashes of her expectations. Tom nodded once, curtly, and turned to retrieve her trunk from the stagecoach. As Elizabeth followed him down the dusty street toward her fate, she couldn't help but notice how the brutal sun had already begun to wilt the silk flowers on her hat. If the West could destroy even false beauty so quickly, what would it do to her? Behind them, the stagecoach driver cracked his whip, and the coach lurched away in a cloud of dust, taking with it her last connection to the world she had known. There was no poetry in the sound of its departure, only the harsh rattle of wheels on stone and the fading jingle of harness bells. Elizabeth squared her shoulders and continued walking, her unsuitable boots already filling with dust. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. She had no other choice. The church was little more than a wooden box with a cross nailed to its peak, paint peeling from its walls like sunburned skin. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the scent of old wood and prairie dust. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Hollis, looked as weathered as everything else in Dry Creek. His collar yellowed with age and sweat. Elizabeth stood before the altar, acutely aware of Tom McAllister's presence beside her, a wall of muscle and silence that radiated heat like a stove. Her hands trembled as she clutched her mother's prayer book, the only familiar thing in this alien landscape. "Do you, Thomas James McAllister, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The Reverend's voice droned like a tired fly. "I do." Tom's response was flat, matter-of-fact, as if he were agreeing to a cattle trade rather than a marriage. When her turn came, Elizabeth's throat felt full of sand. I do." The words tasted like defeat. There were no flowers, no music, no guests save for 2 witnesses pulled from the saloon, a grizzled prospector who reeked of whiskey and a woman whose painted face and low-cut dress marked her profession clearly. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes, when Reverend Hollis pronounced them man and wife. Tom didn't kiss her. He simply nodded, placed a work-roughened hand at her elbow, and guided her back into the brutal sunshine. Mail-order bride arrived expecting a poet, but got a broad-shouldered cowboy instead, Tom said suddenly as they stood outside the church. His voice held a bitter edge. That's what they'll be saying in the saloon tonight. Probably already are. Elizabeth's cheeks burned. You lied to me. Never said I didn't. He walked toward a wagon hitched nearby, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Question is, what are you going to do about it? The anger that had been simmering beneath her shock suddenly boiled over. What am I going to do? I sold everything I owned. I left my family, my home, everything I knew because of those letters. Those beautiful letters that you didn't even write. Tom stopped loading her trunk into the wagon and turned to face her. In the harsh light, she could see lines around his eyes, premature aging from squinting into the sun. You want to go back? I'll buy you a ticket. Won't force any woman to stay who doesn't want to. The offer hung between them like a challenge. Elizabeth knew he was testing her. Knew, too, that pride was all she had left. I have nowhere to go back to, she said quietly. As you well know. He studied her for a long moment, then resumed loading the wagon. Ranch is 2 hours out. Better get moving if we want to make it before dark. The ride was torture. The wagon had no springs, and every rut in the trail jarred Elizabeth's bones. Tom sat beside her, handling the reins with casual competence, saying nothing. The landscape rolled past in waves of brown grass and red rock, punctuated by the occasional scraggly tree that looked as miserable as she felt. Who wrote them? She finally asked when the silence became unbearable. The letters? Tom's jaw tightened. Samuel Chen runs the laundry in town. Used to be a scholar back in China before. He trailed off, shrugging. Paid him $2 a letter. Why? The word came out cracked, plaintive. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, ranch needs a woman, I need a wife. Tried courting local girls, but... He gestured at himself with one hand, a motion that encompassed his rough appearance, his obvious lack of social graces. Samuel said I needed pretty words. Said no Eastern lady would come for truth. The truth being? Life's hard out here. Work from can't see to can't see. No socials, no tea parties, no poetry readings. Just work and wind and waiting for rain that might not come. Ranch is mortgaged, cattle die. Indians raid sometimes, though they've been quiet lately. Not much to offer a woman except a roof and 3 meals a day. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. So you advertised for a wife like you'd advertise for a ranch hand. Pretty much. He glanced at her, and she caught something in his expression. Not quite remorse, but perhaps a distant cousin to it. Figured once you got here, saw the situation, figured you'd either stay or go. Either way, I'd know. How wonderfully romantic, she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Elizabeth had been in any mood to appreciate it. The house was exactly what she'd feared. A low-slung cabin of rough boards with a tin roof and 2 small windows. A few outbuildings dotted the property, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the sparse grass. Tom helped her down from the wagon, and she stood looking at what was now her home. In Boston, she'd lived in a 3-story brownstone with running water and gas lights. This place didn't even have a proper porch, just a rough wooden step leading to a door that hung slightly crooked in its frame. Outhouses around back, Tom said, already unloading her trunk. Wells beside the kitchen door. I'll show you the house. Inside was worse than outside. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and parlor all in one. A cast-iron stove squatted in one corner. A rough table with 2 chairs in the center. Shelves held a meager collection of dishes and supplies. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. Bedrooms through there. Tom indicated a doorway covered by a faded curtain. I'll bunk in the barn tonight. Give you time to settle. Elizabeth walked to the bedroom, pushing aside the curtain. A narrow bed with a straw mattress, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, a single wooden chair. No mirror, no wardrobe, no comfort of any kind. She sank onto the bed, and it creaked ominously under her weight. I'll bring in water for washing, Tom said from the doorway. Supper's usually beans and biscuits. Coffee if you want it. I don't suppose you have any tea. She heard the tremor in her own voice. No? He paused. Could get some next time I'm in town, if you're still here. After he left, Elizabeth sat in the gathering darkness, too exhausted to cry, too overwhelmed to think. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, whistling through gaps in the walls. In the distance, a coyote howled, answered by another, then another, until it seemed the whole prairie was alive with their eerie chorus. She fumbled to light the oil lamp on the washstand, its weak glow barely pushing back the shadows. In her trunk, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, were her books, volumes of Shelley and Keats, her precious Shakespeare, a novel by Jane Austen. They seemed like artifacts from another world now, as out of place in this rough cabin as she was. Tom returned with a bucket of water and a plate of food. He set them down without comment, started to leave, then turned back. For what it's worth, he said quietly. I'm sorry about the letters, Samuel said. He said if I told the truth, no one would come. And I needed... He stopped, shook his head. Doesn't matter what I needed. Wrong is wrong. It was the longest speech she'd heard from him, and the first hint of genuine emotion. But before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a final thud. Elizabeth looked at the plate of beans and the hard biscuit, at the rough walls that were now her prison, at the narrow bed where she would sleep alone on her wedding night. Outside, the wind howled louder, and she could hear grit hitting the windows like tiny fingers tapping to get in. She thought of the letter writer, Samuel Chen, crafting beautiful lies for $2 each. She thought of Tom McAllister, so desperate for a wife he'd pay for false words to lure one west. And she thought of herself, so eager to escape her old life that she'd believed in a fairy tale, followed a siren song to this desolate place. The beans were cold and salty, the biscuit hard enough to break teeth, but she ate every bite, because what else was there to do? When she finally lay down on the straw mattress, still in her wedding dress because she couldn't face the intimacy of changing clothes in this strange place, the coyotes were still howling. Somewhere in the barn, her husband, a stranger who had purchased her with pretty lies, was bedding down with the horses. And somewhere in Dry Creek, people were laughing about the foolish Eastern woman who'd expected a poet and got a cowboy instead. Elizabeth closed her eyes and willed herself not to cry. Tomorrow would come whether she wanted it to or not, and she would need all her strength to face it. The West, it seemed, had no patience for tears or broken dreams. It demanded hardness, resilience, the ability to endure. She would learn. She had no choice but to learn. The wind continued its assault on the cabin walls, and Elizabeth pulled the thin blanket over her head, trying to shut out the sound, but there was no shutting out the reality of what she'd done. The life she'd chosen based on false promises and desperate hope, marriage to a stranger, a cabin in the wilderness, a future as harsh and unforgiving as the landscape itself. Welcome to the West, she thought bitterly. Welcome to your new life. Mrs. McAllister. The rooster's crow came before dawn, jarring Elizabeth from restless sleep. For a moment, she forgot where she was, reaching for the bell pull that should have summoned her maid. Her hand met only rough wooden wall, and reality crashed back. Wyoming, the ranch, her husband who wasn't a poet. She heard movement outside, the creak of the barn door, the clank of a water bucket. Tom was already at work, forcing herself from bed. She dressed in her simplest day dress, though even that seemed absurdly formal for this place. Her hands, soft from years of nothing more strenuous than embroidery, fumbled with the buttons. The main room was cold, the stove dead. Through the window, she watched Tom leading horses to the corral, his movements efficient and purposeful. She should start breakfast, she supposed, though she'd never cooked anything more complex than tea in her life. The stove defeated her immediately. She'd seen servants tend fires, but watching and doing were vastly different things. After several failed attempts with kindling and matches, smoke filling the cabin, she admitted defeat and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Tom was at the well, washing his face with water from a tin basin. He looked up as she approached, water dripping from his jaw. The stove, she managed, feeling foolish. I don't know how. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. I'll show you. Back inside, he demonstrated with patient movements how to clean the ash, arrange the kindling, coax the flame to life. His hands were gentle with the delicate operation, belying their rough appearance. Elizabeth watched, trying to memorize each step. Coffee grounds are in the tin, he said, pointing. 3 scoops to the pot. Beans need to soak overnight. I'll set them up tonight. Show you how. I should warn you, Elizabeth said quietly. I've never cooked. We had servants. Figured as much. There was no judgment in his tone. Just acceptance. You'll learn. He left for the range, and Elizabeth faced her first challenge alone. The coffee turned out bitter as medicine. The biscuits she attempted from a recipe tacked to the wall emerged as blackened rocks. When Tom returned at midday, she served the disaster with burning cheeks. He ate without complaint, washing down the charred biscuits with the awful coffee. Gets easier, was all he said. The afternoon brought new trials. Tom set her to gathering eggs while he repaired fence. The chickens, sensing her fear, turned vicious. One rooster in particular seemed determined to drive her from the coop, attacking her skirts with spurs and beak. She emerged with only 3 eggs and several tears in her hem. That's Lucifer, Tom said when she reported the encounter. Mean as they come, here. He showed her how to carry a stick, how to move with confidence. Can't show fear. Animals sense it. By evening, she was exhausted, her dress filthy, her carefully arranged hair hanging in strings. Tom brought in a rabbit he'd shot, skinned and cleaned it with practiced ease while she watched, fighting nausea. This was food in its most basic form, kill or starve. Tomorrow I'll teach you to milk, he said over another meal of beans. Bessie's gentle enough, long as you're firm with her. Elizabeth nodded, though the thought of touching a cow filled her with dread. Mr. McAllister? Tom, he corrected. We're married now. Tom? The name felt strange on her tongue. How long have you been out here alone? 3 years. Built the cabin myself. Started with 20 head of cattle. Got near 100 now, if rustlers haven't taken any. Rustlers? Cattle thieves? They hit the small ranches mostly. Take what they can, drive them north or east to sell. He poured more coffee, grimacing at the taste but drinking it anyway. Lost 15 head last spring. Nearly broke me. Elizabeth thought of the mortgage he'd mentioned. Is that why you needed a wife? He was quiet for a moment. Bank likes married men better. Show stability, they say. Plus, he shrugged, man gets tired of talking to cattle. It was almost a joke, and Elizabeth found herself nearly smiling. Do they ever answer back? Sometimes think they do. He pushed back from the table. I'll bank up the fire. Gets cold at night. That became their pattern. Tom slept in the barn, Elizabeth in the cabin. He woke before dawn. She struggled to rise with the sun. Slowly, painfully. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, how to build a fire that would last, how to make coffee that didn't strip paint, how to approach Bessie the milk cow with firm hands and soothing voice. The sun was merciless. Within a week, her fair skin was burned and peeling. Her hands blistered from the water bucket, the washboard, the 100 small tasks that ranch life demanded. She learned to haul water, to scrub clothes on a board until her knuckles bled, to chase dust from corners where it gathered like persistent ghosts. Tom was patient, if not gentle, teaching by example more than words. He showed her how to read the sky for weather, how to spot a sick calf, how to bar the door properly against night predators. He never criticized her failures, just quietly fixed what she'd done wrong. One evening, 2 weeks into their marriage, she collapsed on the front step, too exhausted to make it inside. Her prized books sat unopened in her trunk. Her hands were too sore to hold a pen to write in her journal. She was becoming someone she didn't recognize, a woman who smelled of lye soap and chicken coops instead of lavender water. Tom found her there, sat down beside her with careful distance between them. "Gets easier," he said, his constant refrain. "When?" She heard the desperation in her own voice. "Month, maybe 2. Body adjusts. I can't do this." The words escaped before she could stop them. "I'm not built for this life. I read poetry, I play piano, I discuss literature. I don't wrestle chickens and milk cows. Piano wouldn't last a season out here," Tom said quietly. "Wood warps in the heat, cracks in the cold. Poetry doesn't put food on the table or keep the wolves away." "Then why?" She turned to face him, seeing him clearly in the fading light. The sun had carved deep lines around his eyes, but they weren't unkind eyes, just tired. Why advertise for an Eastern bride? Why not find a local woman who already knows this life? He was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Tried that. Local women want better than what I got. Want a man with prospects, proper house, maybe some social standing. I'm just a cowboy with a mortgaged ranch and 100 head of half-wild cattle. So you tricked someone desperate enough to come sight unseen." Yes. The admission was flat, honest. "Question is, what now?" Elizabeth looked out at the land stretching endlessly in all directions. No neighbors for miles, no escape except the weekly supply run to town. She was trapped as surely as if there were bars on the windows. "I suppose I keep learning," she said finally. "Unless you're planning to shoot me like that rabbit when I become too much trouble." It was a dark joke, but Tom's mouth twitched in what might have been almost a smile. "You're tougher than you look. Eastern ladies usually are, under all that silk and propriety." That night, the rustlers came. Elizabeth woke to the sound of horses, the lowing of disturbed cattle. Tom's voice carried from outside, sharp with alarm. She fumbled for the rifle he'd shown her how to load, hands shaking as she crept to the window. By moonlight, she could see figures moving among the cattle, cutting out the best animals. Tom was already outside, his own rifle raised. The crack of gunfire split the night, and Elizabeth's heart stopped. "Stay inside," Tom shouted, but she was already moving. Some instinct she didn't know she possessed drove her out the door, rifle clutched in her trembling hands. The rustlers were trying to drive off a dozen head, whooping and firing into the air to scatter the herd. Tom was one man against 3, crouched behind the water trough, trading shots. Elizabeth had never fired a gun in anger, had only Tom's brief lessons to guide her. But she raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel at the nearest rider, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil knocked her backward, but the shot went true enough to spook the man's horse. It reared, dumping him in the dust. "The woman's armed!" one of the rustlers yelled. "Let's ride!" They scattered, abandoning their stolen cattle, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they'd come. Tom rose from behind the trough, scanning the horizon for stragglers. "I told you to stay inside," he said, but there was something new in his voice. Not anger, something closer to respect. "They were stealing our cattle," Elizabeth said, surprised by her own use of our. "Could have been killed. So could you." They stood in the moonlight, both breathing hard, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging between them. Then Tom did something unexpected. He smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. "That was a good shot. For a poetry reader." Elizabeth felt an answering smile tug at her lips. "I had a good teacher, for a cowboy who can't write his own letters." They worked together to calm the scattered herd, driving them back to the corral. Elizabeth's nightgown was ruined, torn and muddy, but she found she didn't care. She'd defended what was theirs. She'd stood beside her husband against a threat. As dawn broke, they sat on the front step sharing bitter coffee and watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Elizabeth's hands were steady now, the rifle across her lap familiar instead of foreign. "Thank you," Tom said simply. "They would have ruined us." Elizabeth replied, "Taken everything." Yes. She thought about her old life, the safety of Boston society, the predictable rounds of teas and socials, the careful boundaries that kept danger at bay. That life seemed like a dream now, something that had happened to another woman. "I still can't make decent biscuits," she said. "I've eaten worse." Tom replied, which she was beginning to understand was his version of high compliment. The sun climbed higher, and the work of the day called cows to milk, eggs to gather, the eternal battle against dust and weather. But something had shifted in the night. Elizabeth was no longer just enduring this life. She was fighting for it. She rose, straightening her ruined nightgown with indignity that would have made her Boston relatives gasp. "I'll start breakfast. And Tom, tonight, you might consider sleeping in the house. That barn must be getting cold." He looked up at her, surprise flickering across his features. Then he nodded. Just once. Might at that. Elizabeth went inside to wrestle with the stove once more. Through the window, she could see Tom heading to the barn, his stride purposeful as always. He wasn't a poet. He would never quote Byron or write sonnets to her beauty, but he'd taught her to survive, had given her the tools to fight for this hard life they were building together. Perhaps that was its own kind of poetry. The truth came out on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after the rustlers' attack. Elizabeth had finally mastered the temperamental stove and was proud of the breakfast she'd managed. Flapjacks that were actually round, bacon that wasn't charred, coffee that Tom drank without his usual grimace. They sat at the rough table, a comfortable silence between them that had grown since he'd moved back into the house, though he still kept to a bedroll by the stove. "I need to tell you something," Tom said suddenly, setting down his coffee cup with unusual care. Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten. "What is it?" He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded paper, worn soft with handling. "This is one of Samuel's letters, the first one he wrote for me." He placed it on the table between them. "Can't read it myself, that's the truth of it." Elizabeth stared at the letter, recognizing the elegant handwriting that had drawn her across a continent. "You can't read? Know my numbers? Can sign my name? That's about all." His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the table. "Never had much schooling. Started working cattle when I was 8. After my PA died. Ma needed the money more than I needed letters." The shame in his voice was palpable, and Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest. She'd been so focused on her own deception. She hadn't considered his, "That's why you hired Samuel. Couldn't court a woman proper without words, and couldn't write the words myself." He stood abruptly, moving to the window. "Figured once you got here, it wouldn't matter. Figured wrong." Elizabeth picked up the letter, unfolding it carefully. Her own face stared back at her from the photograph she'd sent with her first response. She looked so young, so hopeful, so naive. "Read it to me," she said quietly. Tom turned, surprise evident on his face. "What?" "Read it to me. Show me what you see when you look at these marks on paper." He returned to the table slowly, taking the letter with reluctant hands. His finger traced under the words, his brow furrowed in concentration. "No, that's dear," he said, pointing. "Samuel showed me that one. And here," his finger found her name. "That's Elizabeth. Rest is just marks." Elizabeth watched his face, seeing for the first time not the rough cowboy who'd tricked her, but a man who'd been locked out of half the world. All those books in her trunk, all the poetry and stories and knowledge, they might as well be in Chinese for all he could access them. "I could teach you," she heard herself say. Tom's hand stilled on the paper. "What?" "To read. I could teach you." She thought of the empty evenings, the long winter ahead. "If you wanted to learn, I'm 32 years old, bit late for schooling. My aunt learned to read at 50 so she could study the Bible herself. It's never too late." Tom folded the letter carefully, returning it to his pocket. "Why would you do that, after what I did?" It was a fair question. Elizabeth considered her words carefully. "Because we're stuck with each other, for better or worse. Because you're teaching me to survive out here. Because..." She paused, then spoke the truth. "Because I think you wanted those beautiful words to be yours. That's why you kept the letters, isn't it?" Tom's silence was answer enough. That evening, after the chores were done and supper cleared away, Elizabeth brought out her simplest book, a child's primer she'd packed thinking of future children she might teach. Tom sat across from her at the table, oil lamp between them, looking as nervous as a schoolboy. "We'll start with the alphabet," she said, opening the book. "A is for apple." "Know the letters?" Tom said. "Mostly, it's putting them together that foxes me." So they began. Elizabeth quickly learned that Tom's pride was as formidable as the mountains surrounding them. He hated making mistakes, hated sounding out words like a child. More than once, he shoved the book away in frustration. "This is fool's work," he said after struggling with a simple sentence. "Man my age learning cat and hat like a baby." "You're not a fool," Elizabeth said firmly. "You can track a stray calf through a thunderstorm, fix anything that breaks, read the weather and cloud formations. I can't do any of that. We just have different kinds of knowledge." Slowly, painfully, he began to progress. Elizabeth discovered he had an excellent memory. Once he learned a word, he rarely forgot it. She started labeling things around the cabin. Door, stove, window. Tom would trace the letters with his finger when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, as she was teaching him to write simple words, he surprised her. "That word Samuel used in the letters, enchanting. What's it mean?" Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It means charming, delightful, something that captures you like a spell." Tom nodded, concentrating on forming the letters ENCHANTING with painful precision. "He used it about your picture, said you were enchanting." "That wasn't Samuel's word, was it?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Tom's hand stilled on the slate. "No. Told him you looked. Told him what I thought. He found the fancy word for it." They sat in the lamplight, the word enchanting between them in Tom's unpracticed handwriting. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, answered by another. The sound no longer frightened Elizabeth as it once had. "I need to tell you something too," she said. "About why I answered your advertisement." Tom looked up, waiting. "My family wanted me to marry Mr. Cornelius Ashford. He was 45, owned a shipping company, had buried 2 wives already. He had wandering hands and breath like rotted fish, but he was rich." She traced a finger along the wood grain of the table. "When I refused, they said I was too particular, too proud, that I'd die a spinster. So when I saw your advertisement, when I read those beautiful letters, you ran." Tom finished. "I ran." She met his eyes. "We both deceived each other, in a way. You with false words, me with false expectations." Tom considered this. "Seems we're even then. Seems we are." That night, for the first time, Tom kissed her. It wasn't passionate or romantic, just a brief press of lips before bed, awkward and uncertain, but it was honest, without pretense or borrowed words. The reading lessons continued. Tom progressed from the primer to simple stories, then to the local newspaper when they could get one. Elizabeth watched him puzzle out the cattle prices, the weather reports, the notices of births and deaths. His finger still traced under the words, his lips moving silently, but he was reading. One afternoon, she found him in the barn with one of her books, not Shakespeare or Keats, but a practical volume on animal husbandry she'd brought thinking it might be useful. "This says we're feeding the chickens wrong," he said without looking up. "Too much corn, not enough grit." Elizabeth felt a surge of pride that surprised her with its intensity. "What else does it say?" They spent the next hour discussing chicken digestion. Of all things, heads bent together over the book. When Tom pointed out a word he didn't know, nutrition, Elizabeth explained it, and he nodded, filing it away in that remarkable memory. As autumn approached, the lessons expanded. Tom showed her how to preserve meat for winter, how to can vegetables from the small garden she'd managed to coax from the dry soil. In return, she read to him in the evenings, not poetry at first, but stories of adventure and exploration. tales of other people fighting to survive in harsh lands. One night, as she read from a tale of Arctic explorers, Tom stopped her. That word, perseverance. What's it mean? Continuing on even when things are difficult, not giving up. Tom repeated the word slowly, testing its weight. That's you, he said simply. Perseverance. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. It wasn't poetry, wasn't a flowery compliment about her beauty or grace. But from Tom, who weighed words like gold coins, it meant more than all of Samuel Chen's borrowed eloquence. Read me one of them poems, he said suddenly. From your books. Surprised, Elizabeth fetched her volume of Keats. She chose carefully, finding Bright Star, reading it slowly so he could follow. When she finished, Tom was quiet. Then, don't understand half the words, he admitted. But it sounds like music. That's poetry, Elizabeth said. It's meant to be beautiful, even when you don't understand it all. Like you, Tom said, then immediately looked away, his weathered cheeks darkening. Elizabeth reached across the table, taking his rough hand in hers. I'm learning to be practical. You're learning to read. Maybe we'll meet in the middle somewhere. That night, Tom didn't return to his bedroll by the stove. Their coming together was awkward, uncertain, two people learning each other in the dark. But it was real, without pretense or false words. Afterward, as they lay in the narrow bed, Tom traced letters on her bare shoulder with his finger. Elizabeth. I know that one by heart now, he said quietly. Elizabeth smiled in the darkness. Outside, the wind sang through the grass, and somewhere a coyote called to the moon. The sound no longer seemed lonely to her. It was just the voice of the land, wild and honest, like the man beside her. Tomorrow, we'll start on the harder words, she said. Tomorrow. Tom agreed, his arm tightening around her. They were building something together, not just a ranch or a marriage, but a bridge between two worlds. Word by word, day by day, they were writing their own story. It might not have the flowery language of Samuel Chen's letters, but it was theirs, carved out of hard work and slowly growing trust. And that, Elizabeth thought as sleep claimed her, was better than all the poetry in the world. The drought began in late September, just as Elizabeth had started to feel she was finding her footing on the ranch. The sky turned from blue to brass, clouds teasing the horizon but never delivering rain. The grass, already sparse, withered to brown straw. The creek that fed their water supply slowed to a trickle. Tom stood at the fence line each morning, scanning the sky with growing concern. Should have had autumn rains by now, he said, his new reading skills put to use studying the Farmer's Almanac. Says here we're due for precipitation. The book could be wrong, Elizabeth offered, though she'd learned to trust the accumulated wisdom in those pages. Hope so, but my bones say different. By October, the situation was dire. Cattle stood listlessly in whatever shade they could find, ribs beginning to show through their hides. The vegetable garden Elizabeth had nursed through the summer withered despite her careful rationing of water. Every bucket had to be hauled from the creek, and every bucket meant less for the animals. Tom made the hard decision to sell off 30 head of cattle. Better to sell them thin than watch them die, he said, though Elizabeth could see what it cost him. Each cow represented months of work. Hope for the future. They drove the cattle to town together, Elizabeth learning to work the herd from horseback. The buyers, sensing desperation, offered insultingly low prices. That's robbery, Elizabeth protested after hearing the offer. Those cattle are worth twice that. The buyer, a man named Josiah Hartwell with soft hands and hard eyes, shrugged. Supply and demand. Mrs. McAllister. Every rancher in 3 counties is selling. Take it or leave it. Tom's jaw worked silently. Elizabeth knew they needed the money. The mortgage payment was due, and they had to buy feed for the remaining cattle. Finally, Tom nodded. We'll take it. As they prepared to leave town with their meager earnings, Elizabeth noticed a crowd gathered outside the general store. Mrs. Pritchard, the banker's wife. stood at the center, her voice carrying clearly. "It's a curse, I tell you. Ever since she arrived, nothing but trouble. First the rustlers, now the drought. Bad luck, bride," someone muttered. "Came here with her city ways. Probably angered the Lord with her prideful expectations." Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn. Tom's hand found her elbow, guiding her past the crowd, but not before she heard the final blow. "Still no baby either. What use is a wife who can't give a man sons? Barren as the land, mark my words." The ride home was silent. Elizabeth felt the weight of the town's judgment like stones in her stomach. 6 months married and no sign of a child. In a place where a woman's worth was measured in meals cooked and babies born, she was failing on all counts. That night, as they lay in bed, she finally voiced her fear. "What if they're right? What if I can't—" "Stop," Tom said firmly. "Takes time. Land's under stress. We're under stress. Nature has its own timing." But Elizabeth could see the worry in his eyes. A son to help with the ranch, to carry on the name. It mattered out here in ways it never had in Boston. The drought deepened. They lost 5 cattle to thirst before Tom made the desperate decision to drive the herd 8 miles to the river. It meant leaving the ranch unprotected, camping rough, exposing the weakened animals to predators and thieves. "I'll come with you," Elizabeth said. "It's dangerous. 2-day trip at least, maybe 3 with the cattle in this condition." "I'm coming." They set out at dawn, the cattle moving slowly, reluctantly. Elizabeth had learned to ride adequately, if not gracefully, and she took her position on the flank, keeping the stragglers moving. The sun was merciless, turning the landscape into a shimmering hell of heat waves and dust. By noon, they'd covered barely 3 miles. A calf collapsed, and Tom had to put it down. The shot echoed across the empty land like an accusation. They made camp that night by a dry wash, the cattle lowing miserably. Elizabeth's throat felt like sand despite careful sips from their water supply. She prepared a simple meal over the campfire while Tom stood watch. "Movement," he said quietly. "Northwest, by those rocks." Elizabeth reached for the rifle, now as natural as reaching for a cooking spoon. They waited, tense, until a family emerged from the gathering darkness. A man, woman, and 2 children, their clothes marking them as homesteaders. "Please," the man called out. "We don't mean trouble. Our well's gone dry. The children—" Elizabeth could see the little ones, a boy perhaps 6, a girl younger, their faces gaunt with thirst. Without thinking, she reached for their water barrel. "Elizabeth," Tom warned, "we barely have enough." "We have enough to share," she said firmly, ladling water into the family's empty bucket. The children drank desperately, their mother weeping silent tears of relief. "God bless you," the woman whispered. "We've been walking 2 days, lost everything. The bank took the land when we couldn't make the payment." They shared their meager supper with the family, learning their story, like so many others. They'd come west with dreams, only to be broken by the harsh reality. In the morning, Tom pointed them toward town, giving them one of the weaker steers. "Can't afford that," Elizabeth said quietly, as the family departed with grateful tears. "Can't afford not to." Tom replied, "Today them. Tomorrow maybe us." They reached the river on the second day to find dozens of other herds already there, ranchers jealously guarding their sections of water. Tom found them a spot downstream, and they let the cattle drink their fill. Elizabeth had never seen anything as beautiful as those animals standing belly deep in the muddy water, drinking life back into their bodies. That night, as they camped by the river, a confrontation erupted upstream. The Hendricks ranch hands, drunk and belligerent, accused a Mexican family of taking more than their share of water. Guns were drawn, voices raised. Tom started to rise, but Elizabeth caught his arm. "Not our fight. Could be tomorrow," he said, but settled back. The argument ended without bloodshed, but tension hung over the river camp like smoke. Elizabeth understood now what Tom had meant about the land making people hard. When survival was uncertain, kindness became a luxury few could afford. A coyote slunk into their camp that night, drawn by the scent of weak cattle. Elizabeth woke to Tom's shout, saw him wrestling with the animal that had hamstrung a calf. Without hesitation, she grabbed the rifle and fired. The shot clean and true. The coyote dropped. "Good shot," Tom said, breathing hard. "Getting to be a regular Annie Oakley?" "Who?" "Sharpshooter. Heard tell of her last time I was in Denver." He knelt by the injured calf, shaking his head. "Have to put her down. Legs too torn up." Elizabeth turned away as he did what was necessary, but she didn't cover her ears. This was ranch life, death and survival intertwined. No room for sentiment. They started the drive back the next morning. The cattle strengthened by water, but the journey still perilous. Halfway home, they encountered another tragedy. A burned-out homestead, the family standing amid the ruins. "Lightning strike," the man said dully. "Took everything. House, barn, winter feed." His wife sat on the ground, cradling a baby. 2 other children clinging to her skirts. Elizabeth recognized the look in her eyes, the same despair she'd felt that first night in Tom's cabin. This time, Tom didn't wait for her to act. He cut out 2 cows from their herd, pressing the lead ropes into the man's hands. "Start over, money," he said gruffly. "Pay me back when you can." The man broke down crying, pumping Tom's hand. As they rode away, Elizabeth said, "We can't save everyone." "No," Tom agreed, "but we can save some." They reached home to find the ranch intact, but the situation worsening. The creek was nearly dry. They'd have to make regular trips to the river now, each journey risking the cattle and themselves. That night, as they stood on the porch watching another cloudless sunset, Elizabeth made a decision. "We should sell my books and my mother's jewelry. It would help with the mortgage." Tom turned to her, surprised. "Those are yours. Brought them from home." "This is home now," Elizabeth said. "Besides, what good is Shakespeare if we starve reading him?" "Keep the books," Tom said after a moment. "But the jewelry, if you're sure." "I'm sure." He pulled her close, and they stood together watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "They're wrong. You know, the town gossips. You're not bad luck. The drought started before you came. Would be facing it alone without you." His arms tightened around her. "Rather face disaster with you than prosperity alone." It wasn't poetry, but Elizabeth was learning to value plain truth over pretty words. "We'll survive this," she said, "or die trying." Tom agreed, which passed for optimism in this hard land. A coyote howled in the distance, maybe the mate of the one she'd shot, maybe another drawn by desperation to hunt closer to human habitation. Elizabeth didn't flinch at the sound anymore. She'd learned the language of survival, learned that sometimes the kindest thing was a quick bullet, that water meant more than gold, that community meant sharing even when you had nothing to spare. "Teach me to write something," Tom said suddenly. "Want to put it down proper, in case what?" "Just teach me." They went inside, and by lamplight, Elizabeth guided his hand as he slowly, carefully wrote. October 1874. Drought bad, cattle thin, wife worth more than rain. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, their story, their struggle, their truth. And as another dry dawn approached, Elizabeth knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The land might break them, but it wouldn't separate them. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Probably another false promise, another dry storm. But Elizabeth found herself hoping anyway. Hope, she'd learned, was sometimes all that stood between survival and surrender in this unforgiving place. The false accusation came on a cold November morning. Sheriff Wade Garrison rode up to the ranch with 2 deputies, their faces grim under the shadow of their hat brims. Elizabeth was drawing water from their nearly empty well when she heard the horses, and something in their purposeful approach made her stomach clench with dread. "Tom McAllister," the sheriff called out. "Need you to come out peaceful-like." Tom emerged from the barn, hay fork still in hand, his face carefully neutral. "Sheriff, what brings you out here?" "You're under arrest for the murder of Jake Hendricks. Found him shot dead by the river 2 nights back, right where you had that confrontation." Elizabeth's bucket clattered to the ground. That's impossible. We came straight home from the river. Tom never— Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back, Sheriff Garrison said, hand resting on his pistol. Tom, drop that fork and come quiet. I didn't kill Jake Hendricks, Tom said evenly, setting the hay fork against the barn wall. Had no cause to— His brother Boyd says different. Says you threatened Jake over water rights. Said you'd put a bullet in him if he came near your cattle again. That's a lie. Elizabeth stepped forward despite the sheriff's warning. There were dozens of people at that river. Anyone could have— Boyd says he's got witnesses. 3 of his ranch hands heard the threat. The sheriff produced a set of iron shackles. I'm sorry, Tom. You've been a straight shooter far as I know, but I've got to take you in. Elizabeth watched in horror as they shackled her husband like a common criminal. Tom met her eyes, his face calm, but she could see the fear beneath. In a land where horse thieves were hanged without trial, a murder charge was as good as a death sentence. Take care of the stock, he said quietly. I'll be back soon. But they both knew that might not be true. Justice in Dry Creek could be swift and final, especially when the accused was a small rancher and the victim came from a powerful family. I'm coming with you, Elizabeth declared, already moving toward the house for her coat. No. Tom's voice was firm. Someone needs to mind the ranch. Can't lose everything while I'm sitting in jail. The sheriff allowed them a brief moment. Tom pulled her close, whispered in her ear, Check the tally book. Everything's written down proper. Then louder, You'll be fine. You're tougher than you know. They took him away, and Elizabeth stood in the dusty yard until the horses disappeared over the ridge. Then she allowed herself 30 seconds of despair, leaning against the fence post, fighting tears. 30 seconds. No more, because Tom was counting on her, and she'd be damned if she'd let him down. She spent the rest of the day tending the animals and planning. By evening, she'd made her decision. Saddling Belle, the gentlest of their horses. She rode to the neighboring ranch 5 miles south. Old Jim Morrison and his wife Clara had always been kind, though they kept to themselves. Heard about Tom, Jim said before she could speak. Boyd Hendricks has been spreading his poison in town. Says Tom gunned down Jake in cold blood. It's a lie, Elizabeth said. Tom was with me every moment. We came straight home from the river. Clara poured coffee, her weathered face sympathetic. Truth doesn't always matter when the Hendricks family wants something. What do they want? Elizabeth asked. Jim and Clara exchanged glances. Your water rights, Jim said finally. That spring on your north boundary flows year-round, worth more than gold in drought times. The pieces clicked into place. They're framing Tom to steal our land. Wouldn't be the first time. Remember the Petersons? Similar story 3 years back. Man was hanged. Widow sold out cheap to avoid worse. Elizabeth's hands clenched around the coffee cup. Not this time. I need your help. She spent the night at the Morrison Ranch, returning home at dawn with a plan. First, she needed allies. Second, she needed proof. Third, she needed to keep the ranch running while fighting for Tom's life. The town was against her from the start. When she tried to visit Tom at the jail, Deputy Barnes blocked her way. No visitors for murderers, he said with a smirk. He hasn't been tried yet, Elizabeth protested. Matter of time. Judge arrives next week. Trial, then hanging. That's how it goes. Elizabeth went to Samuel Chen's laundry, knowing she needed every possible ally. The elderly Chinese man listened quietly as she explained the situation. Mr. Tom, good man, he said finally. Paid fair for letters. Never made trouble. He paused, considering. I hear things. Men talk when getting clothes cleaned. Maybe I hear something useful. Her next stop was the telegraph office. She wired her cousin in Denver, a lawyer who'd offered to help when she'd announced her marriage. The response came quickly. Arriving Friday. Stop will investigate. Stop hold hope. Stop Marcus. But Friday was 3 days away, and the town's anger was building. A group of Hendricks ranch hands loitered outside the jail. talking loudly about frontier justice and saving the cost of a trial. Elizabeth recognized the danger, a lynch mob forming in plain sight. She returned to the ranch to find disaster. The fence around the spring had been cut, Hendrick's cattle drinking freely from their precious water source. When she tried to drive them off, Boyd Hendricks himself appeared with 4 armed men. "Just taking what's ours," he said, tobacco juice staining his beard. "Once your husband swings, you'll be selling anyway. Might as well get used to it." "Get off my land," Elizabeth said, rifle steady in her hands. Boyd laughed. "Little Eastern lady playing cowgirl. You won't shoot." Elizabeth put a bullet in the ground at his horse's feet. The animal reared, nearly throwing him. "The next one won't be a warning," she said calmly. Boyd's face darkened. "You'll regret that, woman. Bad things happen to widows alone on the prairie." After they left, Elizabeth worked frantically to repair the fence, knowing they'd return. As darkness fell, she made a desperate decision. Tom had told her to check the tally book. She found it hidden in the barn, and inside discovered more than cattle counts. Tom had been documenting every threat, every suspicious incident, dates and times and witnesses, including a note about Jake Hendricks stealing calves 2 months ago, with Jim Morrison as witness. Armed with this information, she rode through the night back to town. But instead of the sheriff's office, she went to the one place that might offer sanctuary, the church. Reverend Hollis opened the door in his nightshirt, blinking sleepily. "Mrs. McAllister, what brings you here at this hour?" "Sanctuary," she said simply, "and justice, if there's any to be found in this town." She showed him the tally book, explained the situation. The Reverend's face grew troubled. "I've had my suspicions about the Hendricks family, but going against them is what's right," Elizabeth finished. "Isn't that what you preach? Standing up for truth?" By morning, she had her first break. Samuel Chen arrived at the church with news. Jake Hendricks owed money to bad men, gambling debts. They came looking for him 2 nights ago. The night he died, Elizabeth breathed. "Who are these men?" "Dangerous men from Denver, but one left something behind at laundry." He produced a torn piece of paper with partial writing. "Match this to right person, maybe find real killer." Marcus arrived that afternoon, a thin man with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. He immediately set about investigating, interviewing witnesses the sheriff had ignored. Elizabeth divided her time between helping him and defending the ranch from increasingly bold incursions by Hendricks' men. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Clara Morrison rode up to the ranch with urgent news. "My Jim saw something that night. Jake Hendricks meeting with strangers by the river. Money changed hands. Then arguing. Jim was afraid to speak up. But now?" Elizabeth prompted. "I told him he'd better find his courage, or I'd find it for him." Clara said firmly. "He's willing to testify." The trial was set for Monday. Elizabeth spent Sunday preparing, but also preparing for the worst. She loaded all the rifles, barricaded the windows, set water buckets ready in case of fire. If they lynched Tom, she wouldn't go quietly. That night, as she sat alone in the dark cabin, she heard horses approaching. Many horses. She grabbed the rifle, heart pounding, but then heard a familiar voice. "Mrs. McAllister? It's Samuel Chen. Brought friends." She opened the door to find not just Samuel, but a dozen townspeople, the Mexican family from the river, the burned-out homesteaders Tom had helped, even Mrs. Olson from the general store. "Heard Boyd Hendricks plans trouble tonight." "Mrs. Olson said. "Figured you might need watching over." They arranged themselves around the property, armed and vigilant. When Boyd and his men arrived at midnight, expecting to find a lone woman, they found instead a community. "This ain't your business," Boyd snarled. "It is now," Jim Morrison said, stepping from the shadows with his rifle. "Tom McAllister helped every one of us at some time. We remember our debts." Outnumbered and exposed, Boyd retreated, but not before issuing a final threat. "Tomorrow your husband hangs, and you'll all pay for this." The trial was a tense affair. The prosecution presented their case, the threats, The bad blood over water. Jake's body found with a bullet from a .44, same caliber as Tom's rifle. But Marcus was ready. He presented the tally book, Jim Morrison's testimony, and then his masterwork. He'd matched the torn paper to a known criminal who'd been seen leaving town the morning after Jake's death. Furthermore, Marcus announced, I've discovered that Jake Hendricks owed this man $3,000, a debt that Boyd Hendricks seems mysteriously eager to ignore. The truth unraveled quickly after that. Jake had been skimming from the family ranch, gambling the money away. When his creditors came calling, Boyd saw an opportunity, let them kill Jake, frame Tom McAllister, and seize the water rights that would save their own drought-stricken ranch. The judge, brought in from Denver and unbought by local interests, rendered his verdict, not guilty. Elizabeth pushed through the crowd as they released Tom, throwing herself into his arms. He held her tight, and she could feel him trembling. Thought I'd never see you again, he whispered. You underestimated me, she said, half laughing, half crying. I'm tougher than I look, remember? No, Tom said, pulling back to look at her. I knew exactly how tough you were. That's why I wasn't afraid to die. Knew you'd find the truth. They rode home together as the sun set, their neighbors accompanying them part way. The ranch was intact, the cattle safe, the spring still theirs. Boyd Hendricks would face charges for conspiracy and perjury. Jake's real killers were already being pursued by federal marshals. That night, as they lay in their bed, Tom said quietly, I'm no poet, but you're my only verse worth living for. Elizabeth smiled in the darkness, remembering those words from the trail. You memorized that. Some things are worth memorizing. He traced letters on her shoulder again, this time spelling out H-O-P-E. Hope, she asked. What you gave everyone. What you never lost. Even when things looked darkest. He pulled her closer. My ma used to say God sends us what we need, not what we want. Wanted a quiet wife who could cook. Got a warrior who can't make biscuits but can face down a lynch mob. My biscuits are improving, Elizabeth protested. Rather have you watching my back than eating good biscuits any day. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, the first in months. Elizabeth listened to it pattering on the tin roof, feeling the drought in her soul finally breaking. They'd survived the worst the frontier could throw at them. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. I love you, she said, the words simple and true. Love you too. Tom replied, have since the day you put that bullet at Boyd's feet, maybe before. The rain intensified, bringing life back to the parched land. And in their small cabin, two people who'd found each other through deception had built something real, a love as hardy as prairie grass, as enduring as the mountains, as vital as water in a dry land. The morning after the trial dawned clear and cold, ice crystals glittering on the fence posts like scattered diamonds. Elizabeth stood at the kitchen window, watching Tom work with the horses, still hardly believing he was home. The coffee pot bubbled on the stove. She'd finally mastered the art of brewing it strong without making it bitter. Mrs. McAllister? A voice called from the yard. Elizabeth opened the door to find Marcus, her cousin, dressed for travel. You're leaving already? My work here is done, and I have clients waiting in Denver. He paused, studying her. You've changed. Lizzie, when you left Boston, you were... He searched for words. Softer, untested. The West has a way of hardening a person, Elizabeth said. Or revealing who they really were all along. Marcus smiled. Tom's a fortunate man. After he left, Elizabeth found Tom in the barn, mending tack. He looked up as she entered, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip. Samuel Chen came by while you were saying goodbye, he said. Brought news from town. What kind of news? Tom set down the leather he was working. Boyd Hendricks? He's dead. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. How? Shot trying to escape custody. Apparently, he had more to hide than just framing me. The federal marshals found evidence he'd been rustling cattle from half the county, blaming it on drifters and Indians. They stood in silence. processing this final chapter of the ordeal. Elizabeth felt no satisfaction in Boyd's death, only a weary relief that it was truly over. "There's something else," Tom said. "The town council met last night. They want to make amends for what happened. They're offering me a position, deputy sheriff, if I want it." "Do you want it?" Tom shook his head. "I'm a rancher, not a lawman. But it means something. Them asking means we're not outsiders anymore." That afternoon, they rode into town together for supplies. Elizabeth expected hostility, or at least awkwardness, but instead found something else entirely. Mrs. Olson greeted her warmly at the general store. "Mrs. McAllister, I've set aside some of that tea you asked about. Earl Grey, all the way from San Francisco." At the bank, Mr. Pritchard himself came out to shake Tom's hand. "Terrible business with the Hendricks boys. Always suspected they were no good." He'd conveniently forgotten his wife's gossip about Elizabeth being a curse, but Elizabeth chose to let it pass. The most surprising encounter came at Samuel Chen's laundry. The elderly man beamed as they entered, beckoning them to his back room where he served tea in delicate porcelain cups. "I have confession," he said quietly. "The letters I wrote for Mr. Tom, not all my words." Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" "He told me what to say, just not with fancy words. Tell her about the sunset, he say. Tell her it makes the mountains look like they're on fire." "I just make it sound pretty." Samuel smiled. "But the feelings, the seeing, that was all you, Mr. Tom." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. All this time, she'd thought the sentiments in those letters were false, but they'd been Tom's observations filtered through Samuel's eloquence. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked Tom as they rode home. Didn't seem to matter. Words were still borrowed, even if the thoughts weren't. He glanced at her. "Besides, I can write my own letters now. Maybe not as pretty, but they're mine." The next weeks brought a rhythm to their lives that felt almost peaceful. The rain had broken the drought, and the grass began to green despite the approaching winter. The cattle grew sleek again, and Elizabeth's garden, replanted with hardy winter vegetables, showed signs of life. Tom's reading had progressed to the point where he could manage the newspaper without help, though he still moved his lips when concentrating on difficult passages. In the evenings, Elizabeth read aloud from her novels while Tom mended harness or cleaned guns, occasionally asking about a word or phrase. One such evening, as she read from Pride and Prejudice, Tom suddenly said, "That Darcy fellow reminds me of someone." "Who?" "Me. Too proud to use my own words. Had to hire someone else to speak for me." Elizabeth set down the book. "You're nothing like Mr. Darcy. He was born to privilege. You've earned everything you have. Maybe. But I was still too proud to admit I couldn't read. Almost cost me the best thing that ever happened to me." They were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Tom reached for his rifle, old habits dying hard, but relaxed when he recognized Jim Morrison's voice calling out, "Tom, Mrs. McAllister, got news." They met him in the yard, where Jim's usually stoic face was split by a grin. "Town meeting tonight. They're putting together a petition to the railroad company. Want to bring a spur line through Dry Creek, connect us to the main route." "What's that mean?" Elizabeth asked. "Means we could ship cattle direct instead of driving them 50 miles to the railhead. Means the town might actually grow instead of dying slowly." Jim's excitement was contagious. "They want you there, Tom. Your word carries weight now." The town hall was packed that night. Ranchers and townspeople crammed into the small space. Elizabeth watched with pride as Tom stood to speak, his words simple but carrying the authority of a man who'd proven his character. "Railroads got good and bad to it," he said. "Brings prosperity, but also brings change. Question is, are we ready for it?" The debate went late into the night, but eventually, the vote was unanimous. Dry Creek would petition for the railroad. As they filed out, several people stopped to shake Tom's hand or nod respectfully to Elizabeth. Sheriff Garrison pulled Tom aside. "That deputy position's still open if you want it. Town's going to need good men when it starts growing." "Thanks, but no." Tom said, I've got all I can handle with the ranch." "On the ride home," Elizabeth asked, "do you regret it? Turning down the badge?" "No. I've seen what wearing a star does to a man. Makes him hard in ways that go beyond what the land requires." He reached over to take her hand. "Besides, I've got plans for the ranch. Been thinking about breeding horses along with cattle, and maybe—" He paused. "Maybe what?" "Maybe it's time to add on to the house, make it a proper home, with a real bedroom, maybe a parlor, room for additions." Elizabeth's breath caught. They hadn't spoken of children since that awful day when the townswomen had called her barren, but the hope had never died. "That sounds wonderful," she managed. The first snow came a week later, transforming the harsh landscape into something magical. Elizabeth stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the flakes fall. Tom joined her, pulling her back against his chest. "Beautiful," he said. "The snow? Yes." "Not the snow." His arms tightened around her. "You, standing here like you belong, like you've always belonged." "I do belong," Elizabeth said softly. "It took me a while to realize it, but this is home." They watched the snow cover the scars of drought, blanket the rough edges of the land in pristine white. In the distance, a wolf howled, not the threatening sound it had once seemed, but simply the voice of the wilderness they'd chosen to make their own. "I've been thinking," Tom said, "about those poetry books of yours. Maybe you could teach some of the town children to read from them, spread the learning around." Elizabeth turned in his arms, surprised. "You'd want that? Town's changing, going to need educated people, not just folks who can rope and ride." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I like the idea of Dry Creek children learning about beauty along with the practical things." From the man who once said poetry doesn't put food on the table. Still doesn't, Tom said. But maybe feeding the soul matters too. You taught me that. That night, as the snow continued to fall, they made love with a tenderness that had grown from shared trials and mutual respect. Afterward, Tom traced words on her bare shoulder, not just her name this time, but a full sentence. "My wife, my heart, my home." "You're becoming quite the writer," Elizabeth murmured against his chest. "Had a good teacher." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Elizabeth?" "Yes? Those fancy words Samuel wrote, about stars being like diamonds and mountains painted purple. I see those things now, see them because you taught me to look." He paused, searching for words. "What I'm trying to say is, the poetry was always there. I just didn't have the words for it until you came." Elizabeth felt tears slip down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness or frustration like those early days, but tears of complete and perfect happiness. "I love you, Tom McAllister. Love you too, Elizabeth McAllister, more than all the words in all your books could say." Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the hardships of the past year, preparing the ground for new growth come spring. And in their bed, two people who'd found each other through deception and stayed together through truth held tight to their hard-won happiness. The town square confrontation that would cement their place in Dry Creek's future was still to come. But for tonight, they had this each other, their home, and the promise of all the tomorrows they would face together. Spring arrived with a vengeance that year, melting snow turning the roads to mud and the creek to a rushing torrent. Elizabeth stood in her expanded garden, hands deep in the rich soil, planting seeds for what would be their best harvest yet. The house behind her bore signs of prosperity. New windows that actually closed properly. A proper porch Tom had built over the winter. Fresh paint on the walls. Mrs. McAllister, young Timothy Chen, Samuel's grandson, came running up the path. "Pa says to come quick. Important meeting in town." Elizabeth wiped her hands on her apron, noting with amusement how natural the gesture had become. "What kind of meeting?" "Railroad men are here. They're making the announcement." Tom was already hitching the wagon when she reached the barn. "Heard the news," he said, helping her up. "This could change everything." The town square was packed. More people than Elizabeth had ever seen in Dry Creek. Men in city suits stood on a makeshift platform, their clean faces and soft hands marking them as outsiders as clearly as her silk dresses once had. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lead railroad representative began, "I'm pleased to announce that the Mountain Pacific Railroad has approved the spur line to Dry Creek." The crowd erupted in cheers. Elizabeth caught Tom's eye and saw her own mixed feelings reflected there: joy for the prosperity this would bring, concern for how it would change their hard-won life. "Construction begins in 2 months. The man continued. "We'll be hiring local men, buying local supplies. Dry Creek is about to boom." As the crowd celebrated, a commotion broke out near the platform. Elizabeth recognized the troublemaker immediately. Jack Thornton, a drifter who'd been causing problems since arriving 2 weeks ago. He was drunk, waving a pistol, shouting about railroad thieves and stolen land. "Not gonna let you take over," he slurred, the gun swinging wildly. "This town belongs to us, not you city parasites." People scattered, women screaming, men reaching for weapons they didn't have. The railroad representatives cowered on the platform. Sheriff Garrison was at the far end of the square, too far to intervene quickly. Elizabeth felt Tom tense beside her, saw him start to move, but she was closer, and the months of ranch life had made her quick. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton," she said clearly, her Boston accent returning in this moment of crisis. "You're frightening the children." The drunk man swung toward her, gun wavering. "Stay back, woman." "I think not." Elizabeth continued walking, slow and steady, the way Tom had taught her to approach spooked horses. "You see, we've worked too hard to let you ruin this day." "I'll shoot." Thornton's voice cracked. "No," Elizabeth said calmly. "You won't, because you're not a killer, just a scared man who's had too much whiskey." She was close enough now to see the tears in his bloodshot eyes. "What really happened? Mr. Thornton? Did the railroad take your land somewhere else?" The gun drooped. "My farm in Nebraska. They said eminent domain. Took everything my PA built." His voice broke. "Ain't right." "No," Elizabeth agreed softly. "It's not, but these aren't the same men, and threatening innocent people won't bring your farm back." She held out her hand. For a long moment, Thornton stared at it. Then, shoulders sagging, he handed her the pistol. Sheriff Garrison arrived then, taking Thornton into custody with surprising gentleness. The crowd erupted again, this time in appreciation for Elizabeth. She found herself surrounded by grateful townspeople, the railroad representatives pumping her hand and praising her courage. "That was foolish," Tom said quietly when he reached her. But his eyes shone with pride. "And brave, mostly foolish. I learned from the best," she replied, thinking of all the times she'd watched him face danger with calm determination. The celebration continued into the evening. Tables were set up in the square. Food appeared as if by magic, and someone brought out a fiddle. Elizabeth found herself dancing with Tom in the same dusty square where they'd met just a year ago, when she'd stepped off the stage expecting a poet. "Look at them," she said, nodding to the townspeople. 6 months ago, they were ready to let you hang. Now we're part of this place." "You're part of this place," Tom corrected. "I just live here. You made us belong." As if to prove his point, Mrs. Pritchard approached, the same woman who'd called Elizabeth a curse. "Mrs. McAllister, I wonder if I might speak with you about the ladies' literacy circle you've started. Several of us would like to expand it, perhaps start a proper school." Elizabeth spent the next hour discussing education plans, while Tom talked cattle prices with the other ranchers. The railroad would bring better markets, faster shipping, more opportunities. But it would also bring more people, more change, more challenges to the way of life they'd fought so hard to build. Later, as they prepared to leave, Samuel Chen approached with a wrapped package. "For you," he said to Tom, "and Mrs. Elizabeth." Inside was a beautifully bound journal, the cover tooled with images of mountains and cattle. The first page bore an inscription in Samuel's elegant hand. "For your own words, in your own hand, The story of Tom and Elizabeth McAllister. Written true. Tom's hand trembled slightly as he touched the page. Don't know what to say. Then write it. Samuel smiled. You have the words now. The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought, as they crested the ridge that overlooked their ranch. Tom pulled the wagon to a stop. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and purple, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. Elizabeth, Tom said suddenly, I need to tell you something. She turned to him, worried by his serious tone. What is it? I'm glad you came here expecting a poet. He took her hand, rough fingers gentle on hers. Because if you'd known the truth, if you'd known it was just me, you might not have come. And I can't imagine this life without you. I came here for a poet, Elizabeth said softly. But I found a man worth more than poetry. I found a partner, a teacher, a friend. I found my husband. She squeezed his hand. I found home. Tom pulled her close, and they sat watching their land settle into evening. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Smoke rose from their chimney where she'd banked the fire that morning. It was a simple scene, but it was theirs. The railroad will change things, Tom said eventually. Yes, but we'll adapt. We always do. Together. Together. They drove the rest of the way in companionable silence. As they unhitched the horses, Elizabeth noticed green shoots pushing through the earth where she'd planted wildflower seeds. Life returning, beauty growing from harsh ground. That night, Tom sat at the table with the new journal, tongue between his teeth in concentration as he slowly wrote. Elizabeth watched from the stove where she was preparing dinner venison stew that actually tasted good now. Biscuits that were almost light. What are you writing? She asked. Our story. Figure someday someone might want to know how a rough cowboy and a Boston lady made a life out here. He looked up. That all right? It's perfect. She came to read over his shoulder, seeing the words in his careful script. Spring 1875. Ranch thriving. Wife teaching half the county to read. Railroad coming. Future bright. You might mention that I finally learned to milk a cow properly, Elizabeth suggested. And that you read Shakespeare now. Don't get carried away, Tom said, but he was smiling. Man's got to keep some dignity. After dinner, they sat on their new porch, Elizabeth reading aloud from Walt Whitman while Tom whittled a toy horse. For the future, he said when she raised an eyebrow. The night was warm, full of spring promises and the distant howl of coyotes that no longer seemed threatening. I used to hate it here, Elizabeth admitted. The dust, the isolation, the hardness of everything. And now, she thought about it, choosing her words carefully. Now I understand that the hardness shapes us, like water shapes stone. We become what the land needs us to be. She paused. I came here expecting poetry and roses. I found dust and struggle and truth. I wouldn't trade it for all the sonnets in the world. Tom set down his whittling, pulled her close. That sounds like poetry to me. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The railroad construction, the changes to their quiet town, the constant work of ranch life. But tonight, they had this moment of perfect peace. Elizabeth? Tom's voice was quiet in the darkness. Yes. Thank you for not giving up, for staying, for teaching me to see beauty in this hard place. He paused. For being my wife. Elizabeth turned to kiss him, tasting the dust and sweat and honesty that was Tom McAllister. Thank you for being worth the journey. Inside the house, the journal lay open on the table, waiting for more words, more story. Their story, not the fairy tale she'd imagined when those lying letters arrived, but something better. A true story of two people who found each other across deception and distance, who built a life from determination and gradually growing love. The coyotes sang their wild song to the moon, and Elizabeth smiled. She was home. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the American Wild West. I hope you enjoyed the story of Elizabeth and Tom McAllister. Two souls who found unexpected love in the harsh but beautiful frontier. Where are you listening to this story from? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Elizabeth and Tom's journey in the comments below. Did their story touch your heart? What part resonated with you the most? Let's discuss this tale of courage, deception, and ultimately, true love that bloomed in the dusty plains of Wyoming. Until next time, partners.